on a book which Ambassador Vijay Gokhale has finished writing. It is officially going to be launched on the 7th of May. It's titled Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest. And we are going to use this opportunity of the International Relations Conference to talk about the book, to give some publicity to the book, to dig in deeply on Ambassador Gokhale's ideas in the book. And so what I'd like to do is, let's have a conversation, if you agree, Ambassador Gokhale. And let me start by asking you, because none of us has had the opportunity to read the book. I am sure we will all take the first opportunity to buy it and read it. But let me start by asking you that what are the main points that you are making in the book? I guess it is a book about China. I therefore guess it is a book about how to read China, how to understand China. Of course, from the point of view of the Tiananmen protests of 1989, which you and I both lived through in Beijing. So let me ask you those initial questions, and then we can have a broader discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Gautam. As you said, the book is going to be released in the bookstores on the 7th of May. The idea was to do it on much earlier, but I think the COVID situation has impacted on delivery of books to the bookstore as well. But I suppose we are all living through difficult times. The real purpose of writing this book was, firstly, of course, to explain to people in India that the Tiananmen incident of 1989 was not merely an incident covering a few weeks or a couple of months, but was set in the larger politics of China, and that those politics are relevant even in the current situation. So the idea was to give a view to Indians about what China's recent political developments have been in the last 20 or 30 years, why it is important for us today, and how it ties into the situation today. I wrote the book less as an academic work, because I did not think that it is necessary to be a research project, and more as a book which can be read by the ordinary public, by people who are interested in China, who want to know what's happening there, and who would like to have a perspective into what was one of the seminal events in Chinese politics in recent memory.
Right. I remember that you in May and June of 1989, as these protests were roiling Beijing and many other cities of China, you used to visit the universities of China, and you used to read some of the big character posters which were put up in these universities. This is a relic from the Mao time, and though 1989 was post-Mao, these sort of big character posters were very, very important. So my question and my request to you is, can you recollect some of these kind of incidents and experiences that you went through, even as the protests were roiling Beijing and other cities of China?
Yeah, so as you very correctly observed, Gautam, the first clue that there would be some form of a public demonstration over the death of former General Secretary Hu Yaobang actually came from Chinese universities. And one aspect I do touch in the book is how the student community in China has played a vital role in politics from the early 20th century onwards. In fact, the whole May 4th movement, which is today a national holiday in China, was because of student anger at the way in which China's territories, which had been colonized by some of the European powers, were simply handed over to other European powers after the First World War, without any regard for China's sovereignty. So it was in fact a coincidental visit by one of our colleagues to Beijing University, which gave the first indication to us in the Indian embassy. You were also there, I was also there, about the likelihood of trouble. And I would say perhaps among the diplomatic community, the Indian embassy was therefore one of the earliest to realize that something was likely to happen, although the scale and the scope of it was, of course, not evident to anybody at that stage. Now, the big character poster also is an interesting, very Chinese manner of showing protest. These are huge posters done in black ink and brush on large paper and stuck up in universities so that people read it. These were officially actually banned in 1989. In fact, they were banned in 1980. But of course, continued and still continue as a means of protest. And one of the factors I do touch in the book is how these big character posters played a role in the fall of the Gang of Four in 1976, then in the rise of Deng Xiaoping in 1979, and then, of course, subsequently in the Tiananmen incident. So, the one point I do make is, of course, the big character posters are also used by Chinese leaders, not just Mao, but Deng also, when it suited them. And when it didn't suit them, of course, then they were declared unconstitutional or illegal. So that is also part of the political history that I want to sort of acquaint the Indian reader with when I'm talking about the Tiananmen incident.
Yeah. You mentioned that throughout China's recent history, so we don't go way into the past, but you mentioned the May 4th movement, 1919, etc. Student protests have been something which have occurred from time to time, and they have been one of the factors which have brought about change in China. And this is even before the Chinese Communist Party period over ruling China, which was from October 1, 1949. And the twin ideals which the student protests always upheld were the ideals of democracy on the one hand and science on the other. So did you, in the Tiananmen protest, did you also see references to democracy and science? What were the students talking about on these two ideals which have pervaded recent Chinese history?
Yeah, in fact, that's a very interesting question, Gautam, because of course we did see posters in support of democracy. But I think the error that many people made was to assume that the democracy that the Chinese students were talking of was the liberal democracy that the West was preaching in 1989 as a contrast to the Soviet Union. Now, democracy in China, even before the Communist Party took over, was not the democracy of the West. Both Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, who were the sort of the leaders of the Chinese Republic before 1949, did not see Chinese democracy as simply a replication of either British parliamentary democracy or American presidential democracy. There was a certain Chinese element to that democracy. There was a certain Chinese environment in which that democracy had to survive. And therefore, when the students spoke of democracy, they spoke of the right to being heard on their concerns. Now, one of the misjudgments or misperceptions the West made was to immediately assume that what the Chinese were looking for was a separation of the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, a freedom of speech, a decision to elect your leaders, and so on. But these were not what Chinese students were asking for in the posters. So we have to be very clear that where democracy was concerned, there was a Chinese view of democracy which existed even before communism, and the Chinese see themselves as democratic within their own environment, not as a way of supplanting it from outside. The other issue was science, and I think science is something which the Chinese as a people felt had led China from being the world's leading power in 1800 or 1750 to becoming virtually a dying economy by the 1940s. The Chinese have always given a great role to science in their culture. If you look at the discovery of many major achievements, whether it is paper money, whether it is porcelain, whether it is gunpowder, and many others, these have all even earlier come from China. So I think the demand for science was essentially to convey to the public that there was a desire to bring back a scientific way of thinking to grow the economy. And it was in some way a protest against the Cultural Revolution, as well as this blind faith in the little red book of Mao and in the slogans of the Communist Party. Uh, uh, and because students wanted to believe that that their education counted for something, that at the end of it all, their education was what was going to change China, not simply what the Communist Party said. So, in a sense, both democracy and science played a role in this protest, but not in the way that the West believed it played. And I think that was one of the fault lines in many people in the world not understanding what happened in China at that.
Absolutely. Also, I recollect that there was a major visit by the then General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, to China, to Beijing in the middle of May 1989. And the Chinese were desperate to ensure that visit by Gorbachev went off well, went off smoothly. And therefore, to a certain extent, their hands were tied and they didn't take strict and strong action against the protesting students, including those who were sitting in Tiananmen Square, which is the central square of Beijing, and where many of these leadership meetings do take place even now and took place even then. But immediately after Gorbachev had left Beijing, then the Communist Party of China felt that it was able to tackle the student protests. Of course, at first they tried to do it through discussions, and I remember the then General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Chao Ziyang, going and meeting students in the square, etc. So my question, and I wanted you to recollect that period of history and to share with us what are your views about that important visit by Mikhail Gorbachev, and also the broader lessons that the Communist Party of China took away from the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, of the breakup of the former Soviet Union.
I have an entire chapter in that book dealing with Gorbachev's visit. So, since I want the people to buy and read the book, I will only dwell with it briefly. But it was in many ways a turning point. Now, again, a lot of the international community, not just the West, but other members of the international community, simply focused on what appeared to be a very humiliating Chinese situation. That at the time when they were welcoming the leader of the second superpower to China, the Chinese state looked helpless. So that was the image that people carried. But in fact, as I argue in the book, what people missed was the manner in which Gorbachev's visit was used by various political players inside China to play politics. And therefore, I contend that Gorbachev's visit actually for the international community became an issue of China's reputation. But within China, the real game was not China's reputation, but the political fight taking place within the Communist Party, which played out during the Gorbachev visit. And it was during Gorbachev's visit that those who were working and living in China, people like us and other people who read the newspapers, realized for the first time that there was a major political struggle taking place within the Communist Party, and that perhaps it had crossed the boundaries by which it could be papered over, that it might actually crack open the system. So I think to that extent, Gorbachev's visit was a very seminal visit, and I therefore spent quite some time in the book talking about it. And one of the things which I will not talk about, because I hope people will read the book, was a very interesting conversation that took place between President Gorbachev and Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi 1 month after that incident, at which the comments made by Gorbachev are very telling and very prescient. So I think that's something that people will find interesting.
And so what you're trying to convey to your readers, especially to people in India, is that even though there is no multi-party politics in China as we have it here in India, or in the Westminster style of democracy, of parliamentary democracy, that within the Communist Party there is a lot of infighting and there are different opinions, and this is a process where one part of the party could be ranged against another part of the party, and that crises in China, especially post 1949, have always occurred due to differences of opinion within the Communist Party of China. Is that what you're trying to convey?
Yes, in fact, I mean, you're absolutely right there. I mean, there's no doubt this is a one-party state. I mean, nobody is saying that this is by any means a democracy or even democratic in its behavior. But I think we make the mistake in believing that the party is monolithic, that it consists of everybody simply marching to the tune of one man or one woman. Now, we know, of course, that even during the time of Mao, who was the supreme leader for so many years, there were serious fissures and differences in the party, and Mao's own power waxed and waned. And this was true of all subsequent Chinese leaders. Now, one reason I did write this book was to tie in what happened during the Tiananmen crisis to what is happening in China today. So I have a chapter on why what happened in China in 1989 is relevant today. Because again, you have an attempt by a leader to centralize authority and to gain control. But history tells us that any attempt to do so in the past has either resulted in a catastrophic situation within the party, or it has resulted in change being brought about. Now, I think we must be careful not to assume that this will mean the collapse of the Communist Party as such. But what it might mean is severe stresses and strains within that party. And therefore, we don't presume that what we are watching today, the leader who is there today, the system that is there today, will therefore continue to be there 10 years from now. I just want to be clear, that doesn't mean the Communist Party may disappear 10 years from now. It might not, or even 20 or 30 years from now. But what I'm saying is that we should not assume that there is a certain monolithic absolute unity within the party.
So, there is a lot of talk these days about China interfering in politics of open democratic societies, whether it's Australia, where there is a huge concern about this, perhaps in the United States also, in its electoral process, perhaps in India also. Is there any way that our countries, which are democratic and more open, can play a role in intra-party politics in China? Is there any way to influence thinking on their side?
So I think one of the big changes that has happened in the last few years is that China has started interfering in the internal politics of others. This was not the case during the period of Deng Xiaoping and his two successors. In fact, they moved away and stopped support to communist parties throughout Southeast Asia, including support to, or largely stopped support to the Indian insurgent groups in the Northeast. Now, what we are seeing in the current situation is not necessarily support to individuals or parties, but certainly a greater involvement in the internal affairs of other countries. Whether the reverse is possible is, to my mind, there's one point of principle and then there's one point of practical capability. The point of principle is that India has so far, at least publicly, desisted from interfering in the internal affairs of China. We have really not played politics there. And therefore, the question is whether we are willing to abandon that principle. We also expect, of course, that China will reciprocate from that. Now, the second point is whether we have the practical ability to do so. Do we have the leverage within China, whether it is in economic terms, whether it is in intellectual terms, whether it is in diplomatic or military terms to do so? My sense is we may not have that leverage directly, but we have probably the biggest indirect leverage that any country has vis-a-vis China, and that is we have a model of governance, which, if it is executed properly, has the capacity to show the 1.2 or 3 or 4 billion people in China that there is an alternate model of politics. In other words, that a country which is as big as China, as diverse as China, more diverse than China, less developed than China today, still gives the right to its citizens every 5 years to decide who their leader should be, which party should govern. And I don't think any other country in the world, including the United States, has that leverage, because ultimately arguments can be made very succinctly by the Chinese about democracy in the West. The best argument they can make is, were these countries democratic when they developed? And the answer is no. The United States, Britain, Germany, and Japan did not develop as democratic countries. They developed as monarchies or as partially democratic, like the United States before the Civil War, or the United Kingdom before the end of the 19th century. They will also say that, they are much richer than us, so let's become rich and then we will become democratic. But India, of course, started democracy on day one of its independence as a poor, backward, underdeveloped state. So we have a very powerful argument ideologically. And the Chinese know that. The crux here is we have to get our act in order. If we can get our act in order, then I would answer your question elliptically with a cautious yes, which is we have the power to influence developments in China.
No, I must remind you, we are no longer in government, so we don't speak for governments, and we can totally undiplomatic. And I would say that, we should give up, and we have given up this idealistic approach that we will not interfere in other countries' internal affairs. I think we've given that up a long time ago. Of course, as you rightly pointed out, whether we have the capability to do it, I'm not sure, and I don't know. But let me also ask Ambassador Raghavan and Professor Kundapalli, if you are able to unmute yourself, and I'm not sure about that, if you would like to jump in. I would only like to ask one last question before I give the floor to Vijay and then to the two of you. But, one of the approaches of Secretary of State Pompeo in the Trump administration was to target the Communist Party of China, to target the current General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, to criticize his leadership in the hope that there would be change from within the party. So I understand from what you have said that you tend to agree with that approach.
No, I don't think so. I didn't say that. I simply said that there is a demonstration effect that Indian democracy can make on the political system and on the population of China. But I don't think at this stage we have the capability, and I'm not even sure whether we have the inclination. That's not something for me to answer. That's something for people in office to answer. But I don't think we have the capability to do what Pompeo says, or to even necessarily believe in what Pompeo believes. But I believe that the demonstration effect can be very powerful.
Okay. Shrikant or Raghavan, I'll leave the floor to you. Yes, Shrikant.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador Bombawale. Let me congratulate Ambassador Gokhale for the excellent discussion and also the book, which is timely. Zhang Weiwei, a former personal secretary to Deng Xiaoping, he is now in charge of the Center for Building the China Model in Fudan University. When we look at the 19-party Congress resolution, there is the China model export that has been alluded to in the party Congress. And we are now reaching in the next year, the 20th party Congress. I think the export of China model is being publicized extensively. And in the background of the situation in India, we see there is so much of Global Times, Sina.com, others. They've said, see, look at India's democracy. It cannot deliver goods to the Indian people. It cannot modernize. So Zhang Weiwei's argument was in the book on China Wave that look at the British, they have first modernized. They have not introduced the universal suffrage. But began the Industrial Revolution, and then subsequently by 1930s, full universal suffrage, 20s or 30s universal suffrage. Look at India straight away, bang on 1947 independence, they began democratic, and they have not modernized. Of course, the Chinese don't mention to us what happened in the Great Leap Forward or in the Cultural Revolution or on other situations. They only highlight what has happened after the 1980s. not before 1980s. This is a black box for most of them. And so Tiananmen Square, I think, is a landmark. The deal there is we will give you economic progress. Don't ask about the Communist Party's delivery, other issues like democracy, corruption, so on and so forth, which are the main themes in the Tiananmen Square. So in the light of these, because the China model has the party-state export, all the private enterprises, all the state-owned enterprises, all that we see China, anywhere that we see China, it has a background. When we look at, say, Huawei, there is the party units. When we look at the Jack Ma, we have the party behind, or any other that we see. So in the light of this party-state model export, what are the ways that we can counter? In addition, of course, to publicity, propaganda, exposure, what is that we can do in terms of countering this party-state export model?
It's difficult to at this stage see what we can do to counter the party-state export model. I think we have to, my own view is that we have to first focus on getting our own economy in shape. And really, unless and until we can come back to the path of economic growth in the post-COVID situation, our soft power, and democracy is a soft power, will be impacted whether we like it or not. So I think our first priority has to be to get back to that model, the growth model. Secondly, I think we need to make it clear to the Western world that while they have their own priorities with China, we have a different set of priorities. In some cases, these are common, but in some cases, they are different. And I think we should be cautious not to identify completely with the West on political issues relating to China. It doesn't serve our purpose in for instance, raising issues relating to human rights abuses, simply because the West also turns against us. So therefore, we need to be cautious that the Western agenda on China also can be selectively turned on us. And therefore, there are certain aspects where politically we have perhaps a greater commonality with the Chinese. So we have to play this carefully. Where as I said, but through demonstration effect, we must make it clear that our model is the superior model to the rest of the world. But if you use it as a means of attacking China, then my sense is that we should proceed with caution.
I agree with entirely, is that the answer to Shrikant's question is that we should make a success of our own model. And that will speak louder than words, those actions, deeds. If we're able to deliver economic growth, development, increased standards of living to our own people, that will speak louder than any words or any propaganda or any publicity. But Ambassador Raghavan, if I could bring you in also in the discussion.
Thank you. It's a fascinating discussion so far, and I must say that I really look forward to reading your book, Vijay. As I've told you, I've already pre-ordered the book, and it's coming to me on the 7th of May by Kindle. So I look forward to that.
If I could just interrupt for half a second, Ambassador Raghavan, I think we have to make it compulsory reading in the Symbiosis School of International Studies.
You should do that. You should certainly do that. I wanted to ask, you talk about Tiananmen Square, and you talk about actually various movements, political movements in China, as it were, originating from the universities or getting impetus from the universities. Essentially, I have two questions on that. One is that, with the increasing, and I think you've dealt with it in one of your papers, the increasing exposure of Chinese students to Western universities, to Western thought, and the manner in which the Chinese authorities have managed to insulate their exposure to Western practices and to Western lifestyles from their expectations of the system in China. I mean, it's an extraordinary achievement, which I think needs. If you talked earlier about trying to see how you can influence situations in China. I think we need to understand the mechanism by which China controls these. The other aspect of it is, this aggressive nationalism. Again, you've written about this, about how now ideology has been replaced by aggressive nationalism as a binding force in Chinese society in order to get Chinese support for the existing regime. Do the students, do the younger population in China subscribe to this? Are they, in a sense, leading this aggressive nationalism? Or do they fully subscribe to it? Because if they do, then any change of system in China does not presage the change of Chinese attitudes to the world. These are two questions that I wanted to put to you. And the third point, it's a comment really, about you said about scientific culture, the importance of science in Chinese culture. I think you're seeing that in the scientific temper, the promotion of the scientific temper within the leadership of China. I think that is a very, very important reason for China being where it is today. The way in which it has been able to promote science and technology and be able to sort of separate science and technology from the straitjackets of communist thinking, if you like. I don't know if you agree with me on that. These are the points I wanted to make.
But I completely agree with you on the science and technology side. And in fact, most of China's leaders after 1980 have actually graduated in science and technology. So they understand science and technology. On the first 2 points you made, Raghavan, I think they're essentially the same. And while I haven't done research on this subject, anecdotally based on the many years that I have spent in China, we have to be very careful in understanding that the Chinese are a proud people. They take pride in their culture, they take pride in their civilization, they take pride in believing that they have enlightened the world through centuries, that they have also been an engine of growth through centuries. And this does not have anything to do with the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, my point is, I don't think it is the Chinese Communist Party that has necessarily insulated them or managed to control their thought process so that even if they're exposed to the West, they still extol Chinese virtues. I believe that as the Chinese people themselves are extremely proud of their civilization, and to the extent that the Communist Party has delivered recent successes which have allowed China to rise again, they believe that therefore they are they sort of benefit from it. So I completely agree with your statement, which is that a regime change in China may not necessarily change the way in which China interacts with the rest of the world. Indeed, my own unsubstantiated hypothesis is that Chinese will continue to behave with the rest of the world precisely as they are behaving at the moment, even if there was a regime change. But let us say theoretically the economy and culture and everything continued at the same pace, and it was simply a change of guard. If there was a change of guard, there would be no difference. So this is something maybe Srikanth should speak about, because he has studied China in that context much more than me.
Vijay, if I could just ask you something which may not be related to your book, but which brings you to the current situation in China under the leadership of General Secretary Xi Jinping. The party has even moved against people like Jack Ma and his companies like Ant Financial, etc. Obviously, because they see and they feel that there is a potential threat from these large corporations which have developed under their guidance and under their watch, as Professor Kundapalli rightly pointed out. Now, is this a fault line? Is this a fissure in Chinese politics as we move ahead? And can this become a reason for some kind of eruption in the current system that exists in China, the current political system in China?
Yeah. So Gautam, I think this question should be answered by Raghavan, because ultimately, if I recall, Putin also acted against the oligarchs at some point and sent a clear message to them. So the question is it that the insecurity of non-democracies leads at some point to the leadership acting against the oligarchs for fear that the oligarchs have the means to overthrow them? I mean, Raghavan, I think really, is this the Russian example that the Chinese are following?
I would say yes and no, because in the sense that in Russia, the problem at that time was that the oligarchs wanted to use their economic power to capture political power, and actually had succeeded in doing that. And they had control over areas like oil and gas, which was of critical interest to the Russian state. They also had control over the arms industry. So, you had to first regain control of these, which is what they did it in spectacular fashion by throwing Khodorkovsky out and so on. But I think in China, I mean, I stand to be corrected. In China, you had not reached that situation. I mean, you are probably on the verge of reaching that situation when this guy Jack Ma made statements which the political system did not like. But that was, I think, so they probably wanted to nip it in the bud, if you like. But you see, the Russian situation was different. Russia was actually trying to regain control of what was becoming a failed or a failing state. The economic chaos, the political chaos, the social tensions that followed the breakup of the Soviet Union. So what Putin was trying to do was regain control of the country and to bring it together. China does not have that existential. I mean, for Putin, it was an existential threat at that time. And it was on multiple fronts. The oligarchs also had a lot of Western business backing them at that time. There was extensive Western interference in Russian internal affairs at that time, which also was dealt with by telling the oligarchs that either you're with me or you're out of Russia and out of your business. I don't think it's the same situation in China. Maybe it is. They are a bit more sensitive than they ought to be, because I think these guys did project a view of China which got Wall Street on China's side.
Now, I would just add here, Raghavan, that perhaps a perception of existential threat is more important than existential threat. But I think the Chinese leadership does perceive the enormous control that the business leaders have on the digital economy, on financial services, on the digital economy, on digital currencies, and so on, as an existential threat to the communist leadership. And I think that it is not coincidental that they're acting against companies like Alibaba or Tencent or Huarong and so on. And one reason I believe that China is rapidly introducing the central bank digital currency, it's the first country which is likely to introduce it, is precisely because it's trying to regain control over a financial system which it otherwise thinks it will lose between Bitcoin and the other cryptocurrencies, which will then be used by these e-platforms like Alibaba and Tencent to completely take economic control out of the Chinese Communist Party leadership. So I do agree the situation is not identical, but this is something worth studying in terms of a China-Russia comparative analysis. It would be a fascinating analysis to do.
Vijay, if I could ask you a question which is in the chat box, and that particular question is, what prevents our communist parties in India, which have cordial relations with the Communist Party of China, from influencing the Chinese authorities to abandon confrontation with India and adopt collaboration?
Well, I think, to be fair to our communist parties, they have not toed the Chinese line on issues of national security interest, including in 1962, when both the Communist Party of India and the Communist Party of India Marxists were very critical of the Chinese attack in the Northeast and in Ladakh. During the times that they have been members of coalition governments, such as 1996-98 or during the first UPA regime, I think they have tried to play a constructive role in that relationship, although ideologically they are aligned to the to the Chinese communists. I think the problem lies in the fact that they've never really been at the center of Indian power. And so their influence is peripheral mostly, or related to certain individuals who exercise a greater influence than their party does overall.
Since we're veering away from your book, Vijay, what I'd like to do is use my prerogative as the chair to bring the session to a close, but I give you a final 1 or 2 minutes to plug your book, because that's what's normally done in these webinars. And then I'll bring the session to a close and then hand over to our director, Professor Shivali Lovely.
Thank you, Gautam. But before that, one interesting anecdote I must recall, because you are there. If you look at the constellation of people who served in China and on China at that time, we had Mr. Shivshankar Menon as the Deputy Chief of Mission. The Joint Secretary East Asia, who is the overall charge of China policy, was Vijay Nambiar. The Director of the department was Nirupama Rao. I was the first Secretary Political in Beijing, and you were the second Secretary in Beijing. All of us went on to become Indian ambassadors to China. Now, that's not a coincidence. I think my opinion, and I say this in the book, was that perhaps as an embassy and as a government, we were better informed of what happened in 1989 than most Western governments. And I therefore hope that Indians will read this book, because it is written basically to explain to people in India why they have to take an interest in Chinese politics, how it affects and impacts us, how it will impact the young generation as they go ahead, because China will be, if not the most important country in the world, certainly one of the 2 most important countries in the world, and that we will pay a price if we don't take China seriously. And by that, I don't mean the government of India, because it takes it seriously, but I mean the people of India. So this is a very beautifully published book by HarperCollins. It's at the moment available for pre-order. If you just go to HarperCollins, it can be ordered both in print form and in Kindle form. So I look forward to everybody reading the book. And I want to thank Symbiosis for giving me this opportunity to talk about the book. And thank you, Gautam, for chairing this session.
I think with that, we'll bring both the sessions. I mean, there were 2 parts to this morning's session on China and Russia as part of the COVID world and the post-COVID world as we move ahead. I bring the session to a close, and I hand back to our director of this Symbiosis Institute of International Studies, Professor Shivali Lovely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, gentlemen, for 2 extremely riveting, interesting sessions. Ambassador Raghavan, Professor Kundapalli, Mr. Gokhale, you've certainly, sir, you've whetted our appetite for the book. And last but not least, Ambassador Bambawale, and your point is very well noted, sir, that we should make it compulsory for at least the students of SSIS to read the book.